The snow fell like forgotten dreams outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office, each flake a silent witness to the man who had everything except the one thing that mattered. Marcus Chen sat alone on Christmas Eve, the city's most successful tech CEO, surrounded by awards that gleamed coldly in the dim light, staring at his reflection in a computer screen that had become both his companion and his prison. At 52 years old, he had built an empire worth billions, but tonight, in the suffocating silence of his corner office on the 47th floor, he couldn't remember the last time someone had said his name with warmth instead of calculation. The champagne he'd poured himself hours ago sat untouched, gone flat, much like the life he'd constructed with such meticulous precision. If you believe that even the most broken hearts can find their way home, if you believe in the power of unexpected kindness and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment about a time someone's small gesture changed your day, share this story with someone who needs hope tonight, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Marcus hadn't always been this way. There were photographs buried in a drawer somewhere, images of a younger man with light in his eyes, standing beside a woman whose smile could melt winter itself, holding a baby girl with his wife's exact same dimples. But that was before the 80-hour workweeks, before the missed recitals and forgotten birthdays, before the divorce papers served on their 10th anniversary, before his daughter stopped returning his calls and his ex-wife remarried a man who actually came home for dinner. He'd told himself the sacrifices were necessary, that he was building something important, that they would understand someday. They never did. His daughter, Emily, was 23 now, living across the country, and the last time they'd spoken, 6 months ago, she'd told him she was getting married and hadn't decided if he was invited. The words had hit him like physical blows, but he'd responded with the only tool he had left in his emotional arsenal. He'd wired $50,000 to her account and ended the call. The building was empty now, the cleaning crew having finished hours ago. Everyone else had somewhere to be, someone waiting for them, some place that felt like home. Marcus had received exactly 3 messages today, one from his assistant wishing him happy holidays with a level of professional detachment that made it clear she was simply checking a box, one from his brother overseas with a generic family photo he'd probably sent to 200 people, and one from his accountant about year-end tax planning. He'd spent the morning approving bonuses for his employees, generous amounts that would change lives and create magical Christmases for hundreds of families. The irony wasn't lost on him that he could manufacture happiness for everyone except himself. Around 8 in the evening, Marcus finally decided to leave. The thought of going back to his sterile apartment with its designer furniture and its perfect emptiness felt unbearable, but staying in the office felt worse. He took the elevator down, each floor a countdown to a Christmas Eve with nowhere to go. The lobby was decorated beautifully, a massive tree his company had commissioned standing like a monument to festivity he couldn't feel. The doorman, Frank, an older gentleman who'd worked the building for years, looked surprised to see him. They exchanged awkward pleasantries, both men knowing but not saying that it was tragic for the CEO to be leaving this late on Christmas Eve, alone. The streets were quieter than usual, that particular hush that falls over a city when most people are inside with loved ones. Marcus walked without direction, his expensive overcoat doing little to keep out the cold that seemed to seep from somewhere deeper than the winter air. He passed restaurants full of families, their laughter spilling out onto the sidewalk like light from another dimension, one he couldn't quite access. He passed carolers and couples holding hands and children pressing their noses against toy store windows, and with each scene, the weight in his chest grew heavier. He'd spent decades chasing success, believing that achievement was the same as fulfillment, that respect was the same as love, that building a legacy meant something even if you had no one to leave it to. He found himself in a neighborhood he didn't recognize, older buildings with fire escapes zigzagging down their fronts, corner stores with flickering signs, the kind of area he would have lived in during his graduate school days before the patents and the venture capital and the meteoric rise. There was a small park here, just a patch of snow-covered ground with a few benches and a broken fountain. Marcus sat down, no longer caring that the cold was seeping through his clothes, no longer sure why he'd even left the office. The truth he'd been running from for years was catching up to him. He was utterly, completely alone, and it was entirely his own fault. That's when he heard the voice, small and bright, cutting through his despair like a bell. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, was standing a few feet away, bundled in a coat that was slightly too big for her, a knit hat with a pom-pom pulled down over her ears. She was looking at him with the kind of direct, unfiltered concern that only children possess, untainted by social convention or adult caution. She asked him if he was okay, and Marcus found he couldn't answer because the question was so simple and so profound that it threatened to crack something open inside him that he'd kept sealed for decades. The girl introduced herself as Sophia and explained that she lived in the building across the street, and she'd been watching from her window because she was supposed to be asleep but was too excited about Christmas to settle down, and she'd seen him sitting alone in the snow and it made her sad. Marcus tried to assure her he was fine, using the same deflective words he'd perfected in 1,000 business meetings, but Sophia wasn't buying it. She told him, with the absolute certainty of childhood logic, that nobody should be alone on Christmas Eve, and that he should come have a party at her place. Marcus started to refuse, started to explain all the reasons why a grown man couldn't just accept an invitation from a child, but Sophia was already tugging at his hand with surprising strength, telling him that her mama always said their door was open to anyone who needed family, and he looked like he needed family very much. Something in Marcus broke then, or maybe something finally opened. He found himself standing, found himself being led across the street by this tiny girl who had decided, with the beautiful simplicity of innocence, that he deserved kindness. Sophia's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up, the kind of building Marcus would have dismissed as beneath notice in his daily life. But when Sophia pushed open the door, calling out that she'd brought a friend, Marcus stepped into something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine warmth. The apartment was small, probably the size of his office, but it was alive in a way his penthouse had never been. There were decorations made from construction paper, a small tree in the corner decorated with homemade ornaments, the smell of something baking, the sound of music playing softly. Sophia's mother, Maria, emerged from the kitchen, and Marcus watched her face cycle through surprise, concern, and then something softer as Sophia explained how she'd found the sad man in the park. Maria was a nurse, Marcus would learn, working double shifts to provide for her daughter after Sophia's father had died 3 years earlier. She should have been exhausted, should have been wary of this stranger her daughter had dragged inside, but instead, she smiled and said what Sophia had already promised, that everyone deserved family on Christmas, and they were happy to share theirs. The next few hours passed in a blur of small miracles. Marcus found himself sitting at a modest table, eating tamales that Maria had spent all day preparing, listening to Sophia chatter about her school and her friends and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. He helped decorate cookies, getting more flour on his expensive suit than on the cookies themselves, laughing at Sophia's running commentary on his terrible icing technique. Maria shared stories about her shifts at the hospital, about the lives she touched and the struggles she faced, speaking with a richness of spirit that had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with purpose. They watched an old Christmas movie together, Sophia nestled between them on the worn couch, and when the little girl finally fell asleep, her head on Marcus's shoulder, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades, needed. Maria made coffee, and she and Marcus talked quietly while Sophia slept. He found himself telling this woman he'd just met things he'd never told anyone, about the empire he'd built and the family he'd lost, about the daughter who didn't want him at her wedding and the decades of choices he couldn't unmake. Maria listened without judgment, and when he finished, she said something that would change everything. She told him that her husband had been a lot like Marcus, so focused on providing that he forgot about being present, and that he'd died suddenly at work one night before they could fix things, before he could become the man he'd always meant to be. She told Marcus that the fact he recognized his mistakes meant he still had time, that it was never too late to choose differently, that the measure of a man wasn't in what he'd built but in what he did with the days he had left. If this story is touching your heart, if you've ever felt alone and been saved by unexpected kindness, if you believe it's never too late to choose love over success, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and leave a comment below. When Marcus finally left that small apartment at 2 in the morning, he was a different man. He had Maria's phone number in his pocket, not for business or networking, but because she and Sophia had become something rare and precious, friends. He had a handmade ornament Sophia had insisted he take, a crooked star with his name written in a child's careful letters. And he had something more valuable than any deal he'd ever closed, a glimpse of the man he could still become. Before we finish this story, Please take a moment to comment below and tell us, what would you do differently if you realized tomorrow that success without connection means nothing? The next morning, Christmas Day, Marcus didn't go to his apartment. He went to his office one last time, not to work, but to make calls. He called his daughter, and when she didn't answer, he left a message that wasn't about money or logistics but about love and regret and hope. He called his ex-wife and apologized, really apologized, for the first time in years. He called his executive team and told them he was taking a sabbatical, that he was promoting his second in command, that the company would be fine without him because he'd finally learned that being indispensable at work meant being dispensable everywhere else. Then Marcus Chen, the CEO who had everything, walked out of that building and toward a different kind of life. He started volunteering at Maria's hospital, using his wealth not to build monuments to his success but to help people who needed it. He showed up at Sophia's school events, becoming the surrogate grandfather she'd never had. He flew across the country and showed up on his daughter's doorstep, not with a check but with tears and truth, beginning the slow work of rebuilding what he'd broken. It took time, months and then years, but gradually, the emptiness that had consumed him was filled with something real. And every Christmas Eve, Marcus returned to that small park where a little girl had decided that a lonely stranger deserved kindness, and he remembered the night that saved his life. Because Sophia hadn't just invited him to a party. She'd invited him back to his own humanity, back to the simple truth that we're all meant to belong to each other, that no amount of success can substitute for connection, and that sometimes, the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Marcus had spent decades building an empire, but it took one child to teach him how to build a life worth living.